The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairthom.com is the website, xchairthom.com. Not only are we pleased to have Superbeets as an underwriter for our program, but it's a great product that I drink every day. Check it out at Thom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com, or give them a call at 800-568-9889. Superbeets. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Oh, and this book was published, I believe, in the late 90s, just FYI. 1998. America feels like it's unraveling. Though we live in an era of relative peace and comfort, we have settled into a mood of pessimism about the long-term future, fearful that our superpower nation is somehow rotting from within. Neither an epic victory nor over communism nor an extended upswing of the business cycle can buoy our public spirit. The Cold War and the New Deal struggles are plainly over, but we are of no mind to bask in their successes. The America of today feels worse in its fundamentals than the one many of us remember from our youth, a society presided over by those of supposedly lesser consciousness. Wherever we look, from L.A. to D.C., from Oklahoma City to Sun City, we see paths to a foreboding future. We yearn for civic character, but satisfy ourselves with symbolic gestures and celebrity circuses. We perceive no greatness in our leaders, a new meanness in ourselves. Small wonder that each new election brings a new jolt, its aftermath, a new disappointment. I'd add this was at the height of the Newt Gingrich and impeachment and all that kind of craziness. Not long ago, America, which is the predecessor, has really set up Donald Trump. Not long ago, America was more than the sum of its parts. Now it is less. Around World War II, we were proud as a people, but modest as individuals. Fewer than 2 people in 10 said yes when asked, "Are you a very important person?" Today, more than 6 in 10 say yes. Where we once thought ourselves collectively strong, we now regard ourselves as individually entitled. Yet even while we exalt our own personal growth, we realize that millions of self-actualized persons don't add up to an actualized society. Popular trust in virtually every American institution, from business and governments to churches and newspapers, keeps falling to new lows. Public debts soar, the middle class shrinks, welfare dependencies deepen, and cultural arguments worsen by the year. We now have the highest incarceration rate and the lowest eligible voter participation rate of any major democracy in the world. Statistics inform us that many adverse trends, crime, divorce, abortion, scholastic aptitudes, may have bottomed out, but we're not reassured. Optimism still attaches to self, but no longer to family or community. This is the consequence of Reaganism. Most Americans express more hope for their own prospects than for their children's or the nation's. Parents widely fear that the American dream, which was there solidly for their parents and still there barely for them, will not be there for their kids. Young householders are reaching their mid-30s, never having known a time when America seemed to be on the right track. Middle-aged people look at their thin savings accounts and slimmed-to-none pensions, scoff at an illusory Social Security trust fund, and try not to dwell on what a burden their old age could become. Seniors separate into their own leisure world, recoiling at the lost virtue of youth while trying not to think about the future. We perceive our civic challenge as some vast, insoluble Rubik's Cube. Behind each problem lies another problem that must be solved first, and behind that lies another and another ad infinitum. To fix crime, we have to fix the family, but before we do that, we have to fix welfare, and that means fixing our budget, and that means fixing our civic spirit, but we can't do that without fixing moral standards, and that means fixing our schools and churches, and that means fixing the inner cities, and that's impossible unless we fix crime. There's no fulcrum upon which to rest a policy lever. People of all ages sense that something huge will have to sweep across America before the gloom can be lifted. But that's an awareness we suppress. As a nation, we're in deep denial. While we grope for answers, we wonder if analysis may be crowding out our intuition. The reward of the historian is to locate patterns that recur over time and to discover the natural rhythms of social experience. In fact, at the core of modern history lies this remarkable pattern. Over the past 5 centuries, Anglo-American society has entered a new era, a new turning, every 2 decades or so. At the start of each turning, people change how they feel about themselves, the culture, the nation, and the future. Turnings come in cycles of 4. Each cycle spans the length of a long human life, roughly 80 to 100 years, a unit of time the ancients called seculum. Together, the four turnings of the seculum comprise history's seasonal rhythm of growth, maturation, entropy, and destruction. The first turning is a high, an upbeat era of strengthening institutions and weakening individualism, where a new civic order implants and the old values regime decays. The second turning is an awakening, a passionate era of spiritual upheaval, when the civic order comes under attack from a new values regime. The third turning is an unraveling, a downcast era of strengthening individualism and weakening institutions, when the old civic order decays and the new values regime implants. And the fourth turning is a crisis, a decisive era of secular upheaval, when the values regime propels the replacement of the old civic order with a new one. Each turning comes with its own identifiable mood. Always these mood shifts catch people by surprise. In the current seculum, the first turning was the American high of the Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy presidencies. As World War II wound down, no one predicted that America would become so confident and institutionally muscular, yet so conformist and spiritually complacent. But that's what's happened. The second turning was the consciousness revolution, stretching from the campus revolts of the mid-'60s to the tax revolts of the early '80s. Before John Kennedy was assassinated, no one predicted that America was about to enter an era of personal liberation and cross a cultural divide that would separate anything thought or said after from anything thought or said before. But that's what happened. The third turning has been the culture wars, an era that began with Reagan's mid-1980s Morning in America and is due to expire around the middle of the decade, 8 or 10 years from now. Amid the glitz of the early Reagan years, no one predicted that the nation was entering an era of national drift.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. A lot in our show today, a lot of things to talk about. And, you know, there's all this stuff. Well, first of all, what we're going to get to, Senator Jeff Merkley is going to be with us in our third hour talking about, or in our second hour, excuse me, talking about what are they hiding, the children in Brownsville, Texas. What's going on with this? We're going to talk with Senator Merkley about that. Does America need to hold a special election for president? I'm going to get to that in just a second. And about that coming crash, actually, Jeff will be with us the third hour. About that coming crash, that's the second hour. I want to share some economic insights with you that I think are profound and meaningful. And that'll all make sense in about an hour from now. But I want to start out. I got a letter from Marty Kurzfeld. Marty's a writer. He lives in Los Angeles. You can look him up online. He's a good guy. Has done some really, really great work. And lately, he's been sending out to a little group of of people on his email list. Old friends and acquaintances. Periodic musings, ramblings. And the one he sent out this morning was so good and so spot on and so brilliant, and it provoked such a really interesting question that I want to share pieces of it with you intact and then ask that question. And the question essentially is, what do we do if we learn that the President of the United States was not legitimately elected, that the election was essentially stolen? Now, Greg Palast and I have made the case on this program a number of times, and in fact, Greg is going to be with us in our third hour today too. We've made the case a number of times that Chris Kobach knocking hundreds of thousands of people off the election rolls in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania in the months before the election, combined with the efforts of the Republican administration in Michigan to put, quote, defective, end quote, voting machines in Detroit so that at least 75,000 African Americans in Detroit who stood in line for hours to vote in 2016 in this last election, and in all probability did not vote for Donald Trump, who won Michigan by about 14,000 votes, if my recollection is correct. Maybe 11,000. I think it was, 10,400 and something. That 75,000 U.S. citizens stood in line to vote and filled out their ballots and all that kind of stuff. And at the very end, all that was left was their votes for the House, for the Senate, for state and local offices. But not a single one of these 75,000 people who stood in line for hours and hours and hours to vote in Detroit voted for president. They just chose not to vote for president. Who cares, right? So I could build an argument that Trump was elected, that the election was stolen by election rigging. Marty, in this case, is building the case that what he believes Mueller is going to find is that the president was elected because foreign powers, and, to some extent this still has to be determined, but, clearly this was coming out of the Internet Research Bureau, this for-profit company in Russia that has done work for the Russian government, among others, but they're for hire. Anybody can hire them. And we know now that Saudi Arabia wanted Trump to be president. We know that the UAE wanted Trump to be president. We can, it's pretty likely, given everything that's happened, that Netanyahu and Israel wanted Trump to be president. And of course, there's no shortage of American billionaires who wanted Trump to be president. So, who paid the Internet Research Bureau, or was it Vladimir Putin? I mean, that's the consensus of the U.S. intelligence agencies, and it may well be true that it was the Russian government that paid for it. But we don't have that conclusively. But when we get it, which Mueller's investigation is supposed to find, we may well discover that the election was, that in those critical states, those phony baloney ads on Facebook actually swung the election. And so, in a way that would be profoundly illegal. If it was the Russian government or the Saudi government or the Israeli government or the Emiratis, I think you could argue that even if it was the billionaires doing it, the American billionaires doing it, that it's problematic. But in any case, so the question, if we can demonstrate that Donald Trump actually isn't the legitimate president of the United States, that the election was illegitimate, this raises a number of substantial and troubling questions. And Marty has some suggestions for this, and I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think we should do, because there's no provision for this in the Constitution. The Constitution talks it talks about the president being disabled, essentially, unable to serve in office. This was an amendment, I think it's the 25th Amendment, I'm not sure, but it's the amendment to the Constitution that was passed after Franklin Roosevelt had his stroke. Or maybe it was after Jack Kennedy was, whatever. Anyway, so, if the president is disabled and his cabinet and his vice president say, hey, it's time for him to, but there's, and of course there's impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors, but there's no provision for a do-over. And there's no provision for a recall vote. In Wisconsin, you actually had a majority of the people vote to hold an election to recall Scott Walker. And then, of course, the Kochs and their friends came in and poured millions of dollars into Wisconsin, and Scott Walker won that election by a squeaker because of outside money. But it was American outside money, so at least it was considered legitimate. So anyhow, here's what Marty asks. He says, if you find that, it's an open letter to Robert Mueller. And he says, if you find that the president is guilty of having colluded with Russians for the purposes of commandeering that election, impeachment not only amounts to an anemic and ineffective remedy, it's also an inadequate and an unjust one. For even if the president were removed from office, the fruit of that poisoned electoral tree would still leave our government in the undeserving hands of a rogues gallery of people the illegitimately elected president was allowed to put into place around him. In other words, if you don't fix the whole system, if you just remove Trump, but you don't, remove Pruitt and Zinke and Pence and all these other guys, you still have that poison from that illegitimate election. He says it's absurd, Marty Kurzfeld said, it is absurd on its face to imagine that the Constitution or any other legal authority can or should imbue the chief executive with blanket immunity from prosecution. This is Trump's claim yesterday in a tweet. especially when the crime that they're being accused of is the theft of the very office wherein their immunity supposedly magically resides. So you mix together Trump's virtually unlimited pardon powers with his throwing around pardons like he's passing out Halloween candy, an obvious inducement to witnesses to lie. And what do you have? Something that our founders never imagined could happen. Literally never imagined could happen. And then you've got this opinion that says that this opinion that says that the president can't be indicted. Well, that was written in September of 1973 by Robert Dixon, who was the head of the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel. He said that a trial would unduly burden a sitting president. Well, you can have a trial in the Senate. It's the same thing. I mean, but let's consider this. That was 1973. In 1974, Leon Jaworski said, no, we're not going to do that. We disagree with the opinion of the legal counsel. And then Ken Starr in 1998 said, I disagree too with that 1973 letter by Robert Dixon. And by the way, Robert Dixon was working in the Office of Legal Counsel, whose the head of that, the Office of Legal Counsel, his boss, Robert Dixon, was Assistant Attorney General Jay Bybee, the guy who wrote the torture memo for George W. Bush. Not exactly a paragon of, legal thinking, although I believe he's a federal judge now in the Ninth Circuit, as I recall. Trump or Bush or somebody appointed him. Anyhow, Marty ends this: the shameless stealing of a presidential election is a crime the founding fathers and our political ancestors didn't adequately anticipate, as no sensible remedies for such an office are enshrined in our Constitution. So what he's suggesting is that we should bring in Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, ask them to collaboratively occupy the White House from the day of Trump's impeachment for, treason, high crimes, and misdemeanors, if it's demonstrated that he colluded with a foreign power to become president. Bring them in to sit in his place, remove Trump from office, remove his cronies from office, Pence, the cabinet secretaries, everybody, and let George W. Bush and Barack Obama appoint temporary successors between now and November. And then in November, we hold a presidential special election along with all the regular elections that are happening across the country. We have 4 months to do this. In Great Britain, they do elections in 6 weeks. In most European countries, they do them in less than 2 months. We can do this. But there's no constitutional provision for it. Congress could pass a law authorizing it, but that's pretty unlikely given that the Republicans control Congress, unless, and increasingly you're seeing more and more Republicans so terrified of Trump, so backed down, so whipped down, that they are just, President Trump, they're afraid to criticize him, they're afraid to speak out against him, et cetera, et cetera. That, probably this won't happen, but maybe if there was a groundswell of effort. Maybe I'm just, maybe Marty and I are just, talking into the wind here. In fact, in all probability. But do you see any remedies for this? I mean, it's not just impeach Trump because he colluded with a foreign power to become president, or tried to, and then tried to cover it up. But there's also Pence, and there's Betsy DeVos, and her brother Eric Prince, who keeps setting up meetings in the Seychelles for Republicans and members of the administration. And, Jared Kushner and Brian Zinke and Scott Pruitt and Mick Mulvaney. I mean, you've got this rogues gallery, this bunch of corrupt people who are there because of a criminal conspiracy.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
If proven, right now it's an alleged conspiracy. We'll see what Mueller says, but would this be a solution? What do you think? And welcome back. Richard, watching Free Speech TV in Durham, North Carolina. Hey, Richard, what's on your mind today?
Yes, I like to say my opinion of how we got Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the whole thing was fixed from the beginning with them selecting Obama. Then next day, gerrymandered the state elections. After the gerrymandering the state elections, the Electoral College was appointed by most of these Republicans, and the Republicans finally elected, what's his name?
Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that gerrymandering happened right after the 2010 census. It happened in 2011 while President Obama was president. But, you know, it was happening at the state level. There was nothing he could do about it. And now Trump not only is messing with you know, everything, he also wants to mess with the census this year by asking a question about citizenship, which will scare anybody who has anybody in their family who's not a citizen away from answering the questions, which will further decrease the political power of those states and those electoral districts, those counties essentially, or congressional districts, that are largely minority controlled, particularly Hispanic minorities. Back to you, Richard.
How many African American or Hispanics are on the Electoral College?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer because people basically within their political parties volunteer to be electors, and then, you know, if a state votes for a Democrat, then the Democratic electors become the ones who go to D.C., and if a state votes for a Republican, the Republican electors are the ones who go to D.C. To cast the electoral vote. And their names are typically, I mean, they're available, but not widely available, and their race is, to the best of my knowledge, not even listed. I don't know the answer, Richard. I'm guessing very few.
A lot of them on electoral colleges are political hacks that are appointed.
Sure.
And none of them, or very few of them, are black.
I'm guessing you're absolutely right, Richard, although we don't know for sure. But,
so
you know,
this thing could have been fixed from the very beginning of when they appointed Obama.
You know, the Republicans have been working 16 ways to Sunday to rig these elections, between the gerrymandering that you're talking about and, you know, and the setup of the Electoral College. Although the electors in this election, none of them changed a vote. So it didn't really matter who was an elector in the Electoral College because they simply voted the way that their state went. But the way that their state went was, in my opinion, rigged. As I pointed out, Michigan, Donald Trump won Michigan by fewer than 11,000 votes, and over 75,000 people in Detroit, a overwhelmingly African-American city, over 75,000 people stood in line for hours, voted, and the voting machines failed to record their vote for president, which means that most of them voted for Hillary Clinton, 75,000 people, and none of those votes were recorded, so Donald Trump got Michigan, and by getting Michigan, he got the presidency. And I'm guessing that something very similar has happened. Other things have happened in Ohio, we don't know, and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. The whole thing stinks to high heaven. Richard, thank you for the call. So there's multiple ways that this election was rigged, and I think you could build a case based on, frankly, any of them. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And what do we do? What do we do? I mean, literally, the founders never even imagined this. At the very worst, they figured impeachment was the solution. Now, keep in mind, when the Constitution was written, there were no political parties. And, I mean, this is the essence. This whole political lesson, this whole backstory, is the book that Dan Sisson, the historian, first wrote 40 years ago, called the American Revolution of 1800, which was about the election of 1800 when Thomas Jefferson was elected. And and then I edited it and wrote a forward and afterward for it, and you know, it's out now again. It's been reissued, brought back into print. I thought it was such a brilliant book, and I strongly recommend that you get and read this book. It's The American Revolution of 1800 by Dan Sisson and Thom Hartmann. And what Dan found, and blew my mind, was that not only were there no political parties at the founding of our republic, but the founders actively discouraged the formation of political parties. And when the Federalists emerged, they were really not so much a political party as they were the group who were backing the new Constitution as opposed to the old Articles of Confederation. They wanted a federal constitution. But then once they got it, they essentially became a political party during the George Washington administration. And John Adams joined, and then Thomas Jefferson, and then Jefferson became vice president in the Adams administration, the second president, because back then whoever got the second most votes became vice president. And so Adams was president, Jefferson was vice president, Adams was a Federalist, Jefferson was having none of it. He did not like the conservative principles that John Adams was pushing. John Adams, you know, I've told these stories many, many times, and I don't really have the time to go through them anymore, but John Adams basically, once he became president, turned into a maniac. He envisioned himself as a king, and his wife was, you know, encouraging this stuff. And so Jefferson said, screw that. For the last 2 years that he was vice president, he refused to even talk to John Adams. The day that Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, Jefferson left town in protest. So Jefferson started the second political party, the Democratic-Republican Party, which is today we call the Democratic Party. Originally they called it the Anti-Federalists. But they originally, when they wrote the Constitution, did not imagine political parties. And so they literally could not imagine that something like what is happening today could happen, where an entire political party would be captured by an autocrat, in this case Donald Trump, a corrupt billionaire autocrat with the help of a foreign or multiple foreign governments, as a consequence of a corrupt Supreme Court having ruled that it's just fine if foreign money comes in. Read Ruth Bader Ginsburg, read her dissent in Citizens United sometime. It'll take you about 10 minutes. It'll blow your mind. Or for that matter, read John Paul Stevens' dissent. In fact, read both the dissents. They're brilliant. But in John Paul Stevens, he talks about how, you know, under Citizens United, Tokyo Rose has a legal right to not only provide propaganda to the United States, but to you know, throw money into presidential elections and things. So given that they didn't even imagine this was possible, they didn't make a provision for it in the Constitution. And here we are. We've got a guy who clearly was not elected by the majority of the people. 3 million more people voted for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump, number one. Number two, if you just look at Michigan, and you can easily look at the other states where Chris Kobach was active, the election was rigged. And number three, you've got foreign powers, possibly, I mean, we'll find out with Mueller.
Listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
You've got foreign powers interfering in our election in a way, in a real squeaker, in a way that handed the presidency off to Trump. What do we do? Today in our book club, we're reading from Reconstructing the Gospel, Finding Freedom from Slaveholder Religion by Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove with a foreword by the Reverend William Barber II. This is from page 61. The chapter is Living in Skin, and the subtitle is American Slavery and the Problem of Bodies. America's original sin of race-based slavery is rooted in our bodies. While most of us will do what we can to save our own skin, our bodies bear the curse of human rebellion, the sweat of the brow, and the pains of labor. The sins of our fathers and mothers bear down on bent backs and sciatic nerves. Slavery has always been one means humans employ to skirt this curse. To the victor belong the spoils is an ancient truism of war. Often in human history, the spoils include people, but war is not the only way some bodies become subject to others. In the opening lines of the Exodus story, the Bible says, quote, "A new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt," end quote. In the messiness of politics, favor comes and goes. But the people who are in power almost always make sure someone else carries the weight and does the dirty work. The unique contribution of slavery during the establishment of the American colonies was the employment of skin color to assign a class of people to perpetual servitude. Excuse me. Originally, white and black people came to the colonies as servants of the settler class, but race-based slavery emerged as an efficient means of building up the plantation economy by permanently assigning people of African descent to the status of slave. Africans who survived the long journey across the Atlantic Ocean, often chained to one another and packed prostrate in the hold of a ship, became human chattel in the New World. In explicit contrast to the enslavable black flesh of Africans, people of European descent began to imagine themselves as white. By virtue of their whiteness, and for no other reason, they imagined a divine right to own black bodies. For the people whose saleable skin rendered them subject to use and abuse, this arrangement was obviously anathema. Quote, "And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free," end quote, they sang when white folks weren't listening. Tactics of resistance varied, but people of African descent always knew in their bodies the basic heresy of race-based slavery. And in their bodies, white people knew it too. To comprehend the moral contradiction of America's original sin, you must consider what it meant for a young white man to come of age on a plantation. Imagine yourself growing up amid a pastoral landscape in the early 19th century, a half-day's horse ride from the closest city. As for any child, your world is the people you've known and the places familiar to you since birth. The big house, which you've always called home, and the barn where your daddy tied a rope swing from the rafters so you could fly down from the loft and land safely in that mound of hay by the horse stalls. For as long as you can remember, you've always had your studies and your chores to do. Mother always insisted that you learn responsibility, but you always felt closer to Betsy, the enslaved black woman who changed your diapers and cooked your food and picked you up when you fell and skinned your knees. You never remember running down to the barn to play without Betsy's two boys, and Imogen, the girl between them, the one that was born just 3 months after you. For you, a son of so-called privilege, puberty means beginning to make sense of why you kissed Imogen down in the hay pile when you were 6, and why you both always knew you could never tell a soul. It means coming to terms with the fact that you and Imogen both share your father's nose, and it means beginning to internalize an arrangement in which you will one day inherit as property the woman who both competed with your mother for your father's love and nursed you at her breast. If you were a good Episcopalian, as most plantation families were, this is also about the time you would be confirmed as a living member of the body of Jesus Christ. The Southern writer Lillian Smith wrote a century after slavery's end, "Now at one's feet there are chasms that had been invisible until this moment." Describing an experience shared in silence by generations of white Christians, she observed how, quote, "One knows and never remembers how it was learned, that there will always be chasms, and now across the chasms will always be those one loves," end quote. To observe that race-based chattel slavery was a gut-wrenching experience that white people also experienced in their bodies is not in any way to equate their suffering with that of African Americans. It is instead to try to understand the lived experience that informs the ways they read the Bible and imagined their world. Because even though slavery ended in 1865 in the United States, most white Christians went on reading the Bible and seeing the world around them exactly as they had before. Growing up Southern Baptist in North Carolina, I memorized scripture in the King James Version and engaged in a serious program of discipleship as a white adolescent without ever giving serious consideration to the Southern in our denomination's name. Then in 1995, the summer before my freshman year of high school, the Southern Baptist Convention issued an official apology for its endorsement of slavery. There it was. We'd separated ourselves from our American Baptist sisters and brothers some 150 years earlier in order to stay Southern and keep our slaves. Enough water had passed under the bridge for our elders to decide it was time to bury the hatchet. They said they were sorry. But their concession stirred up old fears. Before I'd finished high school, a conservative movement within the denomination insisted we had become too liberal, took over the denomination, and forced everyone who worked for the International Mission Board to sign a statement of faith to which they added an article about female submission. It was the first time in my life I'd seen people on the local evening news being interviewed about my church. The book, Reconstructing the Gospel.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, 34 minutes past the hour. So the essential question is, what do we do when, I would say if, but for a lot of us it's already obvious, when it becomes obvious to the majority of Americans that Donald Trump is an illegitimate president, and therefore everything he has done since he came into office, including all of his cabinet appointments, Mike Pence's activities, the laws that he has signed, that all of these are illegitimate. Whether it's an illegitimacy that can be demonstrated by the way that Chris Kobach and friends and Republicans all across the country threw largely African-American, Hispanic, and Asian voters off the voting rolls just in time for the election through interstate cross-check, which Greg Palast has so brilliantly documented in his, you can see his movie over on Amazon for $2, I think it is, or whatever. It's the best democracy money can buy. It's really worth watching and sharing with your friends because he just lays it out. I mean, he confronts Chris Kobach in that video, number one. Or number two, was it because of the election machine failure in Detroit? Or number three, was it because a foreign power, Russia, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, a foreign power or local billionaires hired a Russian firm, the Internet Research Bureau, to come up with memes that would pit the electorate against each other, that would disrupt our election, and that would cause people to vote for Trump? Any one of those, you could argue, say that he's an illegitimate president. Now, I remember back in 1961, after John Kennedy was sworn in, my father, the Republican, who did not like John Kennedy, he wanted Richard Nixon. My father was saying, that wasn't a legitimate election. They were using, the Mayor Daley in Chicago had these election machines, and they rigged the election with the election machines. Well, it turns out that even if Chicago had voted against Kennedy and for Nixon, that Kennedy still would have won. If the fix was in for Kennedy anywhere, it was in Texas, frankly, and it had to do with Lyndon Johnson. But that's a whole other thing. But I remember my dad and all his Republican buddies and the guys at the John Birch Society and the local Republican community just freaking out. What do we do? Jack Kennedy's an illegitimate president. Well, they were never able to convince the rest of Americans of that, although there are still Republicans who believe that. But they never really came up with an answer. What do we do? Is it Laura or Lautra in Alexandria, Virginia?
It's Laura.
Laura. Hey, Laura, what's on your mind today? Thanks for listening to Sirius XM.
Yes, well, thank you for taking my call. I was just calling to comment on Trump being an illegitimate president and what to do. And I agree with what you mentioned before, the possible solution. However, I feel as though if somebody has been wronged, then we need to right that wrong. And if that means putting Hillary Clinton in office, then I think that would be the appropriate thing to do.
Well, I think an election would probably do that if she chose to stand for election in November. If she didn't choose to, then it would be somebody else. But I think that if we were to install Hillary Clinton without that election happening, even in the face of the evidence of fraud, that would so harden the Republicans. That's why I liked Marty's idea of taking George W. Bush and Barack Obama and having them be basically co-presidents, at least for 4 months. We're just talking 4 months here, right? Or however long it is, July, August, September, October, November, 6 months, 6 months.
Yeah, and I do like that idea and that solution. However, one might argue that she was elected.
Yes.
And therefore, that she should be president from that point on until the term has ended.
Now, if what Mueller comes up with, and unfortunately, I don't think he's looking into the election rigging in Wisconsin and the Chris Kobach stuff at all, which is really tragic, because somebody needs to. But if he was to find that it was Russian manipulation of the election, or manipulation by a Russian agency paid for by the Saudis or somebody, whoever, whatever. And I'm open to any of those. I want to hear the investigation. But if he found that, then actually, Hillary wasn't elected because those votes actually were counted in those states, and it was the election was improperly influenced. And I still think we should have a do-over, a make good, because it was wrong. But
Right, no,
but she was actually elected. On the other hand, she was actually not elected. On the other hand, if you could demonstrate that throwing actual legal voters off the voting rolls simply because they have Hispanic, common Hispanic or African American names, which is what Chris Kobach has been doing. If that was done, then you could argue that Hillary Clinton, in fact, was legitimately elected, and that she should be president right now. So there's a slight distinction there. But,
right. Okay. I can see that. Mm-hmm.
Good points all. Laura, thank you for the call, and thanks for contributing to the conversation. Amy in Gloucester, Mass. Hey, Amy, what's up? Thanks for listening to Sirius XM.
Hi, Tom. Can you hear me okay? I'm on Bluetooth. Can you hear me okay, Tom?
Yeah, it's a little flaky, but let's go for it, Amy. What's up?
Okay, good. First, thank you for addressing this very important topic. Last year, for the entire year of 2017, I was involved in an effort that led to the filing of 3 cases to the Supreme Court with a request to nullify the results on the basis of breach of the Guarantee Clause, which is supposed to protect states from foreign interference.
What is the Guarantee Clause, please?
Yes, it's in the Constitution. I can't quote it. I don't have it in front of me to quote, but basically guarantees that each state cannot have their electoral process interfered with by foreign powers.
Where can I find that in the Constitution, Amy?
Well, if you Google Guarantee Clause, you'll find it. And the attorney who wrote this case, by the way, a dozen petitioners.
Amy, you're breaking up so badly I can no longer understand you. If there's anything you can do to fix that, do it. Otherwise, I'll put you on hold and we'll
I'm trying to fix that. How do I fix it? Well, I'm going to try and fix it. Can you hear me better now, Tom?
Yeah, continue.
Oh, great. I want to give you the name of the attorney who took filed the case to the Supreme Court. You might want to have on. He's a very serious.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Amy. It's falling apart. Your phone is falling apart. Amy's on line 2, Louise, if you want to pick her up and get that information from her. She's recommending that we talk to somebody. Jim in Boise, Idaho. Hey, Jim, what's up?
Hey, Tom, love your show.
Thank you.
I was curious about why George Bush. I mean, him and all his cronies and all their war profiteering and whatnot. I don't understand. I think the co-president thing is a cool idea, but why George Bush?
Well, because he was the last president. I'm not a fan of George Bush either. I think he set us on the road to fascism. I think he radically enhanced the powers of the imperial presidency. He lied us into 2 wars. He's a war criminal. I mean, I can give you the whole long list. But if for a moment we're going to suspend all of our partisan bickering, right, and try to transcend that and rise to the level of what's best for our nation, we have been harmed. There is a cancer in the presidency. There is a cancer in the White House. And it's the consequence of either foreign involvement or the manipulation of elections by very wealthy and powerful people in the United States, or both. Then I think that we would have, I mean, it's only a 5-month period, right, from now till November. I think that we would have to say, okay, we're going to do this on a purely bipartisan basis. We're going to have a co-presidency, and if one of them is disabled or something, I'm not sure what we do about the vice president role, as the president of the Senate. Right. But maybe even just set that aside and just say there'll be no president of the Senate. Mitch McConnell's the president of the Senate for the next 6 months.
And we need to get rid of him also.
Yeah.
In my humble opinion, I look at the Republican Party and Trump as traitors to every American out here. Yeah. They're just, they're trying their best and they're doing it, to destroy America.
They're putting party above country, and that's just fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's pathetic. Anyway, Tom, I love your show, man. I've learned so much listening to you, and keep up the good work, man.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for your kind words, and thanks for the call. Kyle, and by the way, Kyle, hang on just a second. I just found the clause that Amy was talking about, and it's Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution, and it reads, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence." Now, I think you could say that if the manipulation of the election by a foreign power could be interpreted as an invasion, that yes, in fact, Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution could be used as the basis for possibly invoking some sort of special election or doing something. I mean, it ultimately is going to fall to the Supreme Court, which is kind of depressing given that the result, again, you'd have to take Neil Gorsuch off the Supreme Court because he's part of the fruit of that poisoned political tree. So Gorsuch would not be allowed to participate in the process. Anyhow, Kyle in Enid, Oklahoma. Hey, Kyle, what's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. Number one, I know that you can't condone what I'm about to say, but we're facing something here that is different than any of us have ever seen. I'm 63. I paid taxes for 43 years, and I'm sure you've paid a ton of them over the years. Tom, we can't do anything with this guy, and I've just developed a personal plan here based on several things. I don't think, as far as I can recall, and there's been lots of presidents, the last one, or Bush, I mean, that I disagreed with on everything virtually. But I didn't think he was stealing from me, the taxpayer. I think that through his various agencies, not only is Trump stealing from us personally through our taxes, but his agencies are selling off our land. They're doing a lot of things to harm us financially and personally. And Tom, I pay a lot of taxes, and I pay them even if I don't agree, I pay them. But I've never been stolen from before, and that changes things. And I just feel like everyone is just like me. I hear they're frustrated. They don't know what to do. And this is just me. This is what I'm saying I'm going to do. My plan is this. If several things are going to happen, Congress will have to stay in Republican control, or Trump will stay in power for me to do what I'm going to do. But I'm not going to pay my taxes, and I'm going to leave the country. We're going to start selling assets if this happens in November. I'm not going to do a thing until that happens. 65 million people voted for Hillary Clinton, give or take. If we all said no more, that's it, we'll shut this thing down. You take 65 million people out of, you take our
I think if
money
even
out of this.
3% said that, you would shut it down. But again, it's a federal crime to do what you're talking about. So it's pretty unlikely, Kyle.
Well, and we're going to leave the country.
Yeah, well, even leaving the country, though, you still have to pay taxes, at least for a while.
I understand, but they're going to have to catch me first.
Yeah, I guess it depends on where you go and how much money you make there. Because, the year that I lived in Germany, I had to pay U.S. taxes. I didn't think it was fair, but, hey, I paid German taxes and U.S. taxes. But, Kyle, I get it. And the part that you said that was absolutely profound is that this is the first time we've been stolen from. Brian Zinke selling off public lands. That's ours. And selling it off to campaign contributors to Republicans. And Donald Trump, taking money, via the emoluments clause, from his business. And of course, borrowing $1.5 trillion. Hang on just a second.
To Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And borrowing $1.5 trillion that you and I and our children are going to have to pay off just to give it as a tax break to billionaires. Yeah, we've been stolen from, Kyle. Very good point. And welcome back. Let's see here, James in Clear Lake Oaks, California. Excuse me, James. Thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. What's on your mind today?
Thanks. Well, I'm glad as I've been listening to you, you kind of pointed out that it's a couple of different tracks there with what's gone on internally with our elections, like all those people that didn't supposedly didn't vote for president in Detroit, and the voter roll manipulations and so forth, versus something like might get us on that track of saying, oh well, these people figured out that something was going on, so let's blame it on the Russian troll farm taking out Facebook ads, and we'll just jump into Russia from Afghanistan or something like that.
Right.
Because we don't want to wind up like Thailand or Brazil. And these things are kind of interconnected with the various manipulations of the masses that seem to bring about that kind of result, which could be very devastating for our country. So
now, hang on just a second. What am I missing here? In Thailand, you had, in fact, I was in the country when it happened, a military coup that overthrew the government. This was back 20 some odd years ago. In Brazil, it wasn't a military coup. It was, just kind of a popular revolt that was led by the billionaire class against
but the problem is that
Lula.
right now, things are so bad because the street protests that happened there wound up with the leftist president, Lula da Silva, is now in jail on ridiculous charges.
Right.
The right-wing president has a 1% approval rating, and people are actually at the point where they're considering asking the military to step in and take over because the government is on the brink of just not even being able to
which is what happened in Thailand, although the people didn't ask for it. It's what happened in Egypt. They're claiming the people asked for it.
Exactly.
Repeated countries. Yeah, and so you're concerned about a military coup. Is that what you're saying, James, essentially?
I'm concerned about all kinds of things that could happen. I mean, you've got people already who are making the threat that if anybody goes after Trump as a result of this Mueller investigation, that they're going to do blah, 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 this, that, and the other thing. And they're the ones with all the guns.
Right.
All right, so what we need to do is we need to think about what are we good at? We're good at organizing at the grassroots level, working legally. I hope that last guy doesn't leave the country. I hope he stays here and figures out ways to work with his neighbors and community so that if it's necessary or even desirable, just somehow in the long run, we can change the way things work and just kind of build the society that we want, building what I would call alternative power structures. And there's plenty of political theorists that go into this thing. You know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Work with your neighbors so that you know how to grow your own food, you know how to produce your own power, you know how to produce your own to secure your own clean water supply, and you try to talk some sense into these people who, are on the right and they're susceptible to this kind of manipulation, and you say, hey, yeah, I like Jesse Ventura too. He's a great guy. But, you've got to resolve some of your contradictions here. You've got to be able to accept the fact that we need a government that's going to keep our clean air and clean water regulations and protects labor rights and so forth, and stop screwing with other countries all over the world, and especially in our hemisphere, like Nicaragua and so forth, where you see the results that they're bringing about. We don't want that here, and wind up in the same situation that they are. We don't want to be putting them in that situation.
And unfortunately, our dirty hand has been involved in many of those situations around the world. I mean, some would say, karma, although I'm not, sanguine about that. But yeah, I got it. James, excellent point. Thank you very much for the call, and thanks for watching Free Speech. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairthom.com is the website, xchairthom.com. Not only are we pleased to have Superbeats as an underwriter for our program, but it's a great product that I drink every day. Check it out at Thom's Beats, THOMSBEETS.com, or give them a call at 800-568-9889. Superbeats.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800.
Welcome back. John in Elmwood Park, Illinois. It says here you want to disagree with me, John. What's your position?
Yeah, Tom, I do disagree with you. I voted for Bernie Sanders, and there's no way I could have voted for Hillary. So what I did was I voted for Trump. I'm not going to lie, I did. I look at Hillary, I saw the failed status quo, I saw more of the same, more bad trade deals, and I'm just like, this is it. I'm done. I can't do this no more. So, I come from a blue-collar manufacturing family.
I get that, John, and you represent a small but significant portion of the Democratic electorate who did not, who were not happy with basically, third-way policies of the Clintons, et cetera, and I think that the release of all those emails certainly didn't probably help your mood at all when you discovered that the elections were being rigged and whatnot in the primary. But that said, that has nothing to do with whether the election was rigged. You're not speaking to the issue of 75,000 people in Detroit, mostly African Americans, who voted for president and their vote was never recorded. It would have changed the outcome of the election. You're not speaking to 150. Go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, that 75,000 in Detroit that didn't vote. Who runs the machines there? I mean, it's all Democrats. There are no Republicans in Detroit. That's all Democrats, Tom.
No, it's the state. The Secretary of State is the ultimate election official in Michigan, and the Secretary of State of Michigan is a Republican. You can't blame this on the Democrats as much as you might want to. And I don't know if you're a Republican troll or not, but you just can't blame this on the Democrats. That's a whole other topic for a whole other time. Bill in Ecorse, Michigan. Hey, Bill, it's been a long time since I've been in Ecorse. What's on your mind today?
I think that the only fair solution, if we find that Trump has been put in there illegitimately, would be to let Hillary have it. I know that would
be fine with that.
Uproar.
Yeah, I would be fine with that, but I think that if you can prove, and I don't think it would be frankly that hard. I think Greg Palast has the hard evidence that's necessary to do it. I just wish the Democratic Party would pick it up. If you could prove that the election was stolen in the United States by Americans who manipulated voting machines, like the example I gave you in Detroit, and I'm sure there's other examples around the country that we could find, and who at the very least unethically, and I think illegally, removed people from the voting rolls simply because they had common Hispanic or African American or Asian names. If you could prove that, then yes, absolutely, Hillary Clinton should be put in. All of the Trumpies, whatever you want to call them, Trumpettes, should be kicked out of office, and she should reestablish the cabinet, and Tim Kaine should become vice president. On the other hand, if the proof that Robert Mueller comes up with is that yes, the election was influenced by lies that were funded by a foreign power, then you've got another situation, because then the argument is, lies happen in every election. I mean, half the ads out there are filled with lies. And whether the lies came from Russia or came from Saudi Arabia or came from some billionaire, Robert Mercer or something, doesn't matter. Lies are acceptable. And if that's the case, then you can't establish that Hillary Clinton actually is president. All you can establish is that there was a corrupted election. So it becomes a little more complicated. But I get your point, Bill. I absolutely do. Thank you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairthom.com is the website, xchairthom.com. Not only are we pleased to have Super Beets as an underwriter for our program, but it's a great product that I drink every day. Check it out at Thom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com, or give them a call at 800-568-9889. Super Beets.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by
Today in our book club, we're reading from Reconstructing the Gospel, Finding Freedom from Slaveholder Religion by Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove with a foreword by the Reverend William Barber II. This is from page 61. The chapter is Living in Skin, and the subtitle is American Slavery and the Problem of Bodies. America's original sin of race-based slavery is rooted in our bodies. While most of us will do what we can to save our own skin, our bodies bear the curse of human rebellion, the sweat of the brow, and the pains of labor. The sins of our fathers and mothers bear down on bent backs and sciatic nerves. Slavery has always been one means humans employ to skirt this curse. To the victor belong the spoils is an ancient truism of war. Often in human history, the spoils include people. But war is not the only way some bodies become subject to others. In the opening lines of the Exodus story, the Bible says, quote, "A new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt," end quote. In the messiness of politics, favor comes and goes. But the people who are in power almost always make sure someone else carries the weight and does the dirty work. The unique contribution of slavery during the establishment of the American colonies was the employment of skin color to assign a class of people to perpetual servitude. Excuse me. Originally, white and black people came to the colonies as servants of the settler class, but race-based slavery emerged as an efficient means of building up the plantation economy by permanently assigning people of African descent to the status of slave. Africans who survived the long journey across the Atlantic Ocean, often chained to one another and packed prostrate in the hold of a ship, became human chattel in the New World. In explicit contrast to the enslavable black flesh of Africans, people of European descent began to imagine themselves as white. By virtue of their whiteness, and for no other reason, they imagined a divine right to own black bodies. For the people whose saleable skin rendered them subject to use and abuse, this arrangement was obviously anathema. Quote, "And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free," end quote, they sang when white folks weren't listening. Tactics of resistance varied, but people of African descent always knew in their bodies the basic heresy of race-based slavery. And in their bodies, white people knew it too. To comprehend the moral contradiction of America's original sin, you must consider what it meant for a young white man to come of age on a plantation. Imagine yourself growing up amid a pastoral landscape in the early 19th century, a half-day's horse ride from the closest city. As for any child, your world is the people you've known and the places familiar to you since birth. The big house, which you've always called home, and the barn where your daddy tied a rope swing from the rafters so you could fly down from the loft and land safely in